Hey everybody, I'm excited to get into lesson 4 in our story of God where we're talking about Noah and the flood. And depending on how much ground I can cover in the next 45 minutes to an hour, I may have a supplementary video, but we're going to start by talking about the story of Noah, particularly in the book of Genesis chapter 6. And so let's get started just by reading the first 8 verses of Noah chapter 6, or I'm sorry, Genesis chapter 6. I'm going to read these verses from the Septuagint, and as we continue to go through the Old Testament, I'll make sure I tell you when I'm reading from a different translation. So Genesis 6, chapter 1. And it happened that when humankind began to multiply on the face of the ground, daughters were born to them. Then the sons of God saw the daughters of humankind, that they were beautiful, and they took for themselves wives from all that they chose. And Yahweh said, my spirit shall not abide, or my breath shall not abide with humankind forever, in that he is also flesh. And his days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim, it's a Hebrew word, the Nephilim, were upon the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God went into the daughters of men, or daughters of humankind, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty warriors that were from ancient times, men of renown. And Yahweh saw that the evil of humankind was great upon the earth, and every inclination of the thoughts of his heart was always only evil. And Yahweh regretted that he had made humankind on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. And Yahweh said, I will destroy humankind, whom I created from upon the face of the earth, from humankind to animals to creeping things, and to the birds of the heaven, for I regret that I have made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of Yahweh. So we'll stop there. All right, let's stop right there. The first thing I want you to notice is in verse 6, where Moses tells us that God regretted making man and that he was grieved in his heart. Again, this is consistent with our belief that the pre-incarnate Christ was begotten without any foreknowledge or experience with his own creation, and he was discovering things as he went along in some kind of relationship with them. And, despite being of the same kind and the same essence of the Father, he didn't have the same capabilities as the Father. Otherwise, we would actually have to conclude that Moses didn't know what he was talking about in terms of how and why the Son was reacting this way, and we would have to basically throw all of Moses' writings into question. For example, if Christ knew absolutely for certain ahead of time that man would turn wicked, even before he created him, how would he have any room for regret? And why would he be grieved? Because he would know it was going to happen. It would be part of his plan. And so we have to take that as an indication that, again, the only begotten Son was born without experience or foreknowledge of his own creation. Now, for the rest of these verses, there are typically a series of questions that come to mind when people read these first several verses. So I want to go through those right now. And the questions like, what was the pre-flood population? Like, how many people actually died when God sent the flood? And we'll talk about the flood in more specifics later, and it might be at the end of today. It might be in a different session. Who are these sons of God? And who are the daughters of men? Who are the Nephilim, or some people say Nephilim? Who are these giants that the book of Genesis talks about in chapter 6? And when it says that God would not strive, or his spirit would not strive or live among men for 120 years, does that mean that God limited man's lifespan, human lifespan, to 120 years? So let's start with these, and we're just going to deal with these one at a time. Let's talk about actually the pre-flood population. According to the Population Resource Bureau, there are several assumptions that have to be made for any forecaster to project population growth for any given period of time. And there are scientific formulas that are designated to do this, and these are well known and used in statistics and forecasting. But anybody who wants to project a population, they need to know a few things. For example, they need to know the starting population, like how many people are you beginning with? They need to know the fertility rate. What's the average lifespan of a woman, and how many kids is she likely to have? And they also need to know the migration rate, how many people come in and go out of a particular geographic region. And of course, they have to define a specific period of time. But if we're looking at the world population, which we would be in trying to estimate how many people were alive at the time of the flood, migration doesn't matter, right? So it's not like people are leaving the world and coming into the world in that sense. And so for our purposes in trying to figure out how many people were alive at the flood, we really have to look at everything else with the exception of the migration rate. So we need to know the overall growth rate, which most recently has been estimated to be 1.2%. We need to know fertility and birth rates. For example, the average lifespan is 72 years, and in the world today, a woman is going to bear 2.1 children. And obviously that's an average because you can't have 2.1 children. And we also have to know what the mortality rate. And you have to, again, know the projected time period for growth, whether you're looking at a year or 5 years or 100 years. Now, on the screen, I have the current growth statistics for the entire world for the year of 2018, or starting at the year of 2018. So if we start with a current population of 7.6 billion people, and if we assume that the growth rate is 1.2%, and that would include the lifespan of 72 years and the average woman having 2.1 children, and that's the average across the entire world. And if we go from 2018 and we project forward to 2036, when we expect the Lord to return, then when the Lord returns, based on these mathematical formulas and these growth rate assumptions, there will be about 9.4 billion people. Meaning in the next 18 years, there's going to be almost another 2 billion people. And this has secular scientists very worried because they estimate that the world in its current condition and the current geography can only reasonably sustain about 10 billion people. And this is where I think some, secular, honestly pagans and these atheists, they just get really worried about population control. So the question really is, if we have these established scientific formulas and sets of assumptions that allow us to calculate the population from any time period to another, can we not use the same calculation to see or to estimate how many people were alive at the flood, right? We know the time frame. We know the flood was in the year 1651 after creation. We know we started with 2 people. What we don't know is we do. On average, the average person lived about 850 years. And so what we can do is we can plug some assumptions into these calculators. And if we assume, again, that we started with 2 people, with Adam and Eve, as they came out of the Garden of Eden in the first year, it would be literally in the second week after creation. And up until the flood, which was 1651 years later, even if we assume the same rate of fertility and growth, which is grossly underestimated, right? The average lifespan before the flood was 857 years, according to the biblical record. If you take all the genealogies and the ages and average them, you get 857 years. According to Josephus, Eve did not have 2.1 children. She had 55. She had 55 kids, male and female. Nevertheless, if we ignore the greatly enlarged lifespan and childbearing capacity of women during that period of time and just kept the current statistics, yet we started with 2 people and we went 1651 years, then based on these estimates, there would be about 700 million people on the continent of Pangaea the year the flood happened. Think about that. 700 million people. And that's only if we keep the growth rate at 1.2% and don't make any adjustments for greatly increased longevity and increased childbearing capacity. Now, if we adjust the growth rate from 1.2% to a mere 1.3%, then the pre-flood population would be almost 4 billion people. Now, I'm willing to bet that the vast majority of people who think about the flood story and think about how many people might have been on the earth, they might think, maybe there was a few thousand, maybe a few 100,000, maybe tens of thousands. Well, that's not what population growth forecasting tells us, right? If we just use the mathematical formula and the simple assumptions of today's growth rate, which again grossly underestimate the lifespan and the childbearing capacity of women during the pre-flood age, these estimates tell us that there were hundreds of millions of people at the very least. And that's a profound thought. So Where did I get this? I just want to let you know that I used an online calculator that has all of these different statistics and the calculations embedded within them. So anywhere from 700 million to several billion people is really what the estimates are. And in fact, if you look at the assumptions and just make a few modifications, it's actually potentially up to 10 billion people that could have been alive at the time the flood that actually happened, right? So that gives us some clarity on how significant it was that God judged the world and wiped it out and then started over. So let's move on to the next question then, which is, who are the sons of God and the daughters of men? And I will tell you that there is kind of a prevailing thought out there that the sons of God refers to the fallen angels, and that the daughters of men refer to human women. And basically the common belief is that when Satan rebelled, he took some of his friends, his angel friends, with him. And these fallen angels came to earth where they mated with human women and they gave birth to literal giants. And that's what people think that the word Nephilim refers to in Genesis 6. And again, some translations, some English translations literally use the word giant. So where does this thought come from? Because it wasn't always part of Christian belief. And really it comes from the book of Enoch. The book of Enoch was written by a Jewish sect called the Essenes. Judaism was split into three different major subdivisions or sects. There was the Pharisees, there was the Sadducees, and the Essenes. And the Essenes were Jewish mystics who blended Plato's Greek philosophy with Judaism, much like the Gnostics blended Plato or Platonic teachings with Christianity. The Essenes were mystical Jews who blended Plato's Greek philosophy with the original Judaic faith. And what the book of Enoch does is it spins this elaborate mythology about how the original sin was actually not the fall of man in the Garden of Eden. And in fact, it has this elaborate mythology that explains the angelic realm and how there are different levels of angels, and it actually names levels or names these different angels. And they say that the original sin was not Adam and Eve in the garden, but it was the rebellion by the fallen angels led by an evil angel called Azazel. And 1 Enoch chapter 6 verse 8 apparently quotes God saying to the angel Raphael, quote, "The whole earth has been corrupted through the works that were taught by Azazel. To him ascribe all sin." And again, this is the Enochic Judaic or the Essenic Judaic view of where original sin came from. And what was that sin? Well, theoretically, it was mating with human women and creating these angel-human hybrids, these Nephilim, these giants that Genesis 6 talks about. And the mythology of Enoch goes on to create this elaborate angelic hierarchy, very much like you see in the pluralistic pantheon of Greek and Roman mythology, and how they corrupted man, and that the reason why the world is evil wasn't because of man's nature, but was the influence of these demons. And that's really why God destroyed the world. In fact, he destroyed it because of the evil of the angels, not because of the evil of men. The book of Enoch also teaches that when these angel-human hybrid giants died, that their immortal souls remained to roam on the earth. And that's what we call demons. And so in the Enochic mythology, demons are the immortal souls of these angel-human hybrid giants, rather than being the fallen angels themselves. And by the way, Enoch describes these giant angel-human hybrids as being 450 feet tall. Tall tale indeed, right? So let's just toss that whole concept out, that in Genesis 6, where it talks about the sons of God were pleased by the daughters of man and went in and mated with them. Let's just toss that out in the interpretation where it says that these were fallen angels that mated with humans. We've already established that the Bible says that kind can only replicate kind, right? So we don't have hybrids. We don't have God-human hybrids. We don't have God-angel hybrids. We don't have angel-human hybrids. We just don't see it. It does not happen. So really what that is, it's just Greek mythology disguised in the cloak of Judaism. Now, the people who believe that the giants were the result of fallen angels fornicating with humans sometimes refer to the book of Job, where the phrase sons of God in one instance refers to, in three instances refers to angels. But there are several problems with their position and their interpretation. First of all, while Job certainly lived around the time of Abraham, we've talked before about how he was contemporary of Abraham. The book of Job, the book recounting the life of Job, was actually written much later. And it was written in Israel probably after the conquest of the promised land under Joshua. And in fact, the book of Job wasn't even considered Jewish canon until after the Babylonian exile. And that was probably 1,400 years or so after Job and Abraham lived contemporaneously. And that what that means is that Job was certainly not known to Moses, and he was not known to the audience that Moses wrote the book of Genesis to. He wouldn't have expected them to know who Abraham was. I'm sorry, not Abraham. He wouldn't have expected him to know who Job was, because again, that was written much, much, much later. So whether the author of Job used that phrase to refer to angels or not has absolutely no bearing on what Moses meant when he used the term sons of God. You can't retroactively fit the meaning of the book of Job written 1,400 years or more later. I'm sorry, not 1,400 years or more later, but written much later, probably 900 years later. You can't retroactively fit that phrase from Job to define what Moses meant when he used the term sons of God. Especially when Moses is so clear in the first chapters of Genesis that like produces like, and there is no crossbreeding. And Moses is actually pretty clear that there are two classes before the flood. There was the righteous and there's the unrighteous. The whole world had gone wicked. And then in verse 8 it says, but Noah found favor in the sight of the Lord. Now, in order to show who the sons of God are, we need to jump forward to 1 John chapter 3. So just go there for a second in your Bible. 1 John 3. We're going to read in verse 10. John says, in this the children of God and the children of the devil are manifest. Whoever does not practice righteousness is not of God, nor is he who does not love his brother. For this is the message that you heard from the beginning, that we should love one another, not as Cain, who was of the wicked one and murdered his brother. And why did he murder him? Because his works were evil and his brother's righteous. Now, John is quite clear here, as is Paul in Galatians chapter 3, that sons and daughters of God are those who are in a covenant relationship with him, who are practicing righteousness by obediently following his laws and by following his instructions. Anyone who is not in a covenant and does not follow his way and practice righteousness is called a child of the devil. And even though this is a New Testament reference, it was exactly the same with the Jewish people, wasn't it, right? Across all ages, God considered those who were obedient to him as his adopted children, and that includes the pre-flood era. Go back now, let's go to Genesis 4, verse 25. Genesis 4, 25. This is after Cain murdered Abel. And this is, again, I'm reading from the Septuagint here. Verse 25, Genesis 4, Adam knew Eve, his wife, and having conceived, she brought forth a son and called his name Seth, saying, quote, for God raised up for me another offspring in the place of Abel, whom Cain killed. Seth had a son, and he called his name Enosh. This one hoped to invoke the name of the Lord. Now, what's the difference between invoking the name of the Lord versus, most translations here would say, calling on the name of the Lord? What's the difference between those two phrases, or what they mean? Well, the Greek word for invoke it's epikaleo, and it can mean to call or to summon someone, but it also means to give someone a name, specifically to give them a surname. And what's more important is that this was written grammatically in what's called the middle voice, and we've talked about the middle voice before. And basically what that means is that Seth and his descendants who followed the Lord called themselves after the name of the Lord, basically saying, we are your people because we're in a covenant with you and we're following your path and we're practicing righteousness. These people, Seth and Enosh, his son, and his descendants, were the original sons of God. Literally the first fruits, if you will. And, Tim will deal with this concept again in the Revelation study when he talks about the second of the two groups of 144,000. And again, he'll develop more detail on that when he does that in the Bereans lessons. But let me make sure I'm being clear in what I'm saying, is that this phrase, the sons of God, does not refer to angels, particularly fallen angels in the case of Genesis 26. It basically means the lineage of people descended from Seth who followed God's ways, who were in a covenant relationship with him, and who called themselves by his name. We are the Lord's people. Now, notice one more word in Genesis 26. It said that Seth and Enosh hoped to invoke the name of the Lord. So my question is, what was the hope that they hoped in? And really, this refers back to Genesis 3:16. It's the hope of the Redeemer. It's the hope of the seed of the woman who would eventually have victory over the seed of the serpent. Right? Genesis 3:15 is where God pronounced the curse. Listen to what Josephus, who's an ancient Jewish historian, listen to what he said regarding Seth. Now this Seth, when he was brought up, and came to those years in which he could discern what was good, became a virtuous man, as he was himself of an excellent character. So did he leave children behind him who imitated his virtues. All these proved to be of good dispositions. They also inhabited the same country without dissensions and in a happy condition, without any misfortunes falling upon them till they died. They also were the inventors of that peculiar sort of wisdom which is concerned with the heavenly bodies and their order, or to say it another way, astronomy. Now, there are a few other problems that people who believe that sons of God means fallen angels and that they fornicated with human women. It's a few other problems that they can't solve. So first of all, if fallen angels seduced and victimized human women, why does God wipe out mankind, punishing the victims and not simply punishing the rebellious angels? Why wipe out man if indeed human women were victimized by fallen angels? God's immediate reaction was to declare the downfall of mankind. And if that interpretation is true, then that paints God as not being a just judge, which we know he is. The second problem that this position has is that the phrase where it says that they took wives or took women, this, both the Hebrew and the Greek, never means fornication. It never means rape or adultery or any kind of immoral sexual act. It always refers to the institution of marriage that God had set in place in Genesis 2 with Adam and Eve. Basically, they were saying that the sons of God married the daughters of men. And that clearly implies no forced intimacy. But what it means is that the line of Seth, the righteous line of Seth, eventually lost its way and began to intermarry with women of unrighteous people. And they were drawn into a wickedness that took over the entire earth, with the exception of Noah and his family. And this is a theme that continues to play out in the history of the Jewish people, where they're constantly told to not intermingle and intermarry with the pagan nations. And just look at Solomon. Look at the fact that he had hundreds of foreign wives, and it led to his downfall because he followed after their pagan gods. It was a righteous people forsaking the laws and the covenant of God that led to the flood. That's what it was. It was people who were in covenant relationship forsaking the covenant and turning to evil and wicked ways. Now, Tim, several years ago, wrote a 43-page paper that is posted on the Four Winds website that argues for, and in my opinion, conclusively settles this whole issue. If you need to be further convinced on this, then I would suggest you take that 43-page paper and read through it in its entirety. But for now, let's move on. Let's make the assumption that what I'm stating is correct, that sons of God coming into or taking wives of the daughters of men refers to the righteous line of Seth, the descendants of the righteous line, forsaking their covenant with God and intermarrying with women of unrighteous people, right? Let's just hold that for the moment. So let's move on to the next question, or the next main concept in Genesis 6, and that is, who are these giants? Right? If the giants are not the human angel hybrids between fallen angels and human women, who are they? And it's not just who are these giants or these Nephilim, but when were the Nephilim? We have to answer both of those questions, who and when. So let's start first with the when question. The problem and the solution centers around the phrase after that in verse 4. And let me read the verse 4, and you can read it along with me. I'm reading now from the New King James. There were giants on the earth in those days, and also afterward, or after that, when the sons of God came into the daughters of men, and they bore children to them. Remember, it's referring to marriage and not forced intimacy and producing angel human hybrids. These were the mighty men who were of old, men of renown. So again, there were giants on the earth in those days and also afterward or after that. Now, this is a slightly complicated Greek grammar argument, so if you have interest, just make sure you're paying attention. Most scholars connect the phrase after that as referring to in those days. After that, they're connecting it to in those days, right? Let me read it again. There were giants on the earth in those days, and also after that or afterward. So the problem is that if you relate the phrase after that as referring to in those days, then you fall into this false fallen angel myth, and it implies that the giants didn't exist until the angels fell and fathered hybrid giants with human women. And it also implies that these giant hybrids existed after the flood, in those days and afterwards, which is impossible because all flesh was destroyed in the flood with the exception of Noah and his family. So it creates an absolute problem that they can't solve. But there's another big problem here, and this is where the grammatical argument really kicks in. And this, again, it's a little more complicated. So, I mean, if you can't track it, that's fine. There's not a big deal. But basically, this phrase uses what's called a demonstrative pronoun, like where it says after that. The word that is called a demonstrative pronoun. And in Greek grammar, the demonstrative pronoun has to agree with the thing that it refers to in what's called the case, the number, and the gender. And so what we're seeing here, when we look at the grammar of this particular statement, is that the characteristic of that, let me say it this way, sorry. When we compare the characteristics, the grammatical characteristics of the word that and the phrase those days, this is what we see here on the screen. In those days has what's called the dative case, it's plural in number, and it's feminine in gender. But the demonstrative pronoun that, when it says after that or afterwards, is in a different case. It's in the accusative case. It's in the singular number, and it's in the neuter or neutral gender. And so grammatically, the phrase that or afterwards simply cannot refer to those days. It can't do it. It's just not pointing to that. So in Genesis 6, where it says, now giants were upon the land in those days, and after that, what does after that refer to? Well, it refers to the singular fact that in those days when the line of Seth began to intermarry with pagan descendants of Adam, that giants already existed. Giants already existed before these statements. Let's take a look at the Septuagint, and I'm going to show it to you with some improvement in punctuation to reflect really what the grammar says. And, forgive me for all the highlighting that you might see on the screen there, but I really have to make a few points here, because here's how the Greek really reads. Now, giants were upon the land in those days, comma, and after that, whenever the sons of God were visiting the daughters of humans and they were fathering children for themselves. Those were the giants who were from long ago, the people of renown. Moses' point is that before the line of Seth began to intermarry, the giants were already there. They weren't the result of the intermarrying and procreation. The giants already existed. That's what the grammar absolutely requires. And they continued to exist during the period of time when the Sethite rebels were marrying women of the wicked lineage, descended from Adam, obviously. Just focus on the word whenever there for a moment, that's highlighted in yellow. The word whenever it's called a conjunction. Basically, a conjunction joins two clauses or two sentences together, like and is a conjunction, but is a conjunction. So is whenever. But it's a conjunction that denotes coincidence, not causation. The conjunction whenever never tells us about cause, it tells us about timing. So Moses didn't say that there were giants on the land in those days because the sons of God were visiting with the daughters of men. His point was that there was a coincidence in timing, that the giants were there first, and they were there while Seth's line began to intermarry with the daughters of man. And the grammar absolutely proves this, right? The giants were there before. They were not a result of Seth's line forsaking the covenant and then beginning to intermarry with unrighteous women. So the question then is, if they were there beforehand, where did they come from? And does the word giant mean what it does to English, which is a very tall or a very large person? Is that actually what the Bible is talking about when the translators translate the underlying Greek or Hebrew into the word giant? Well, certainly they weren't 450-foot tall angel-human hybrids of the Essenic or the Enochic Judaism that we see in the book of Enoch. In Hebrew, the word again is Nephilim. And it's the root word, like in these ancient languages, most words begin, like the root words are actually verbs. They're action words. And then from that, you can change it and you can create a noun or an adjective. So in Hebrew, there's a verb which is nephal, and it literally means to fall or to fell, meaning like to fell, like to, make a tree fall down, for example. And so the word Nephilim, it may actually have a double meaning. It may mean a fallen one, or it could mean like a tyrant or an oppressor, somebody who causes the downfall of somebody else. And the Greek word is gigantes, and it really carries these same connotations. So a giant isn't a giant in the sense of how we define it today in terms of really, really tall person. A giant was a bully. A giant, a Nephilim or a giant gigantes was a bully, a tyrant, or was an oppressor. And all we have to do to confirm this is look a few chapters forward in Genesis chapter 10, where Moses describes this guy called Nimrod, which we'll talk about in a different lesson. So go to Genesis 10 for me. Again, I'm going to read from the Septuagint here. Genesis 10:8 says, Cush began Nimrod. He was the first to be a giant on the earth. He was a mighty hunter before the Lord of God, and that word mighty is the same word translated as giant. It's just translated mighty. Because of this, they will say, as Nimrod was a mighty hunter before the Lord. So Nimrod was a giant. Now remember, this is post-flood, where if indeed giants in that sense existed, they all would have been killed, right? So Nimrod being a giant, it's not like Nimrod was an angel-human hybrid that was 450 feet tall, not at all. In fact, he had a human father named Cush, who was the grandson of Noah. So Nimrod was the great-grandson of Noah, post-flood. So clearly the word giant doesn't mean super tall dude. Just doesn't mean that at all. It means someone who oppressed others, a tyrant who used violence and intimidation to gain authority and power. And the Bible says in Genesis 6 that these kind of people were around before Seth's line abandoned the Lord and intermarried with the unrighteous lines of Adam, which was essentially the rest of the entire known world at the time. Now, there are several other interesting tidbits in Tim's paper, so I would encourage you to download that and read it. Again, it's 43 pages. It takes some time, but it's well worth it. But I'll leave it to you. I'll leave it to anyone else who wants to read it on their own. So let's move on to our final question for this session right now, which is Genesis 6, verse 3. The Lord God said, "My breath will not at all remain among these humans for very long because they are flesh, but their days will be 120 years." So there are three main opinions about what this means. The first is that God would send the flood in 120 years. Well, the problem is that the flood came 100 years later, not 120. And people who believe in this position will say, well, God started with 120 years, but people were so wicked he brought it earlier. Well, I understand the argument, but I don't think you can really substantiate that. The second opinion is that the 120 years is a limit on individual human lifespan. Now, that's also not correct for a couple of reasons. The first is that 10 generations after the flood, Isaac died, like Abraham Isaac, right, that Isaac? Isaac died at 180 years old. And you're talking 10 generations later. So if this is what God meant, that he was going to limit the human lifespan to 120 years, he sure took his time getting around to it. But more importantly, there's two really important things here, is that the verse refers to these humans as a collective. It's talking about mankind in totality. It's not talking about the lifespan of individual people. But I'll tell you that there's actually one argument that really settles all of this. Just read this again and read it on the screen, if you will. Again, this is from the Septuagint. The Lord God said, "My breath will not at all remain among these humans for very long." Now, what's the difference between my breath and the breath of life? If, as some people believe, this refers to the lifespan of human beings, my breath is not really the correct reference. The difference between when God says my breath versus when he says the breath of life is that all living creatures, including animals, have the breath of life, including unrighteous man. However, the only ones who had God's breath, my breath, the Holy Spirit, were those who were in a covenant relationship with him. So really, what God is talking about is he's talking about how he was only willing to have his presence, his spirit, his breath among a rebellious people for so long. He could only put up with it for so long, tolerating their collective disobedience. Now remember that in the context here, these people, where it says that my breath will not at all remain among these humans, these people refers to the righteous line of Seth, who were supposedly in a covenant relationship with God, because earlier at the end of chapter 4, we saw that the descendants of Seth and Enosh were calling themselves after the name of the Lord. So they were supposedly in a covenantal relationship with God, but they had turned their back on him, and they had began to marry into the general population, and adding to those giant tyrants who were bringing immense wickedness on the earth through oppression and intimidation. Basically, these rebellious descendants of Seth, who were supposed to be in a covenant relationship with God, they forsook God's warnings, just like the Jews would do later. when they intermarried with, say, the Moabite women, and also with Solomon that we mentioned just a moment ago. Basically, their wickedness and their disobedience took men, righteous men, further away from the Lord. And again, the most powerful argument that I think settles this is to understand the distinction between the breath of life and the holy breath of God, which is also called my breath in some distinct circumstances. And that difference really is the focal point. Again, it's not a statement of individual lifespan. It's not a statement of when God was going to bring the flood. It was a statement of how long God was willing to continue to deal with rebellious people who were supposed to be obedient to him because they had agreed to a covenant. To drive that point home, God's presence dwelling among a group of people never is ever referred to when it talks about lifespan. If you look at some of the Psalms and Proverbs where it talks about wisdom and prolonging the days of your life, wisdom prolongs your life. Having the presence of God, having his breath, his spirit among the people, always refers to a sign of his covenant. And finally, just again to make another point, the verse here is not about withdrawing the breath of life which is common to all living creatures, but his breath, which again is the divine breath, the breath of eternal life, that's reserved only for his people who are in covenant relationships with him. So if we understand that, why 120 years? Did God remove his presence after 120 years? No, because from the flood forward, God always had a covenant with somebody. It began with Noah and his family, and then started with Abraham just a few hundred years later. Is there any indication that God's presence left at that time? None whatsoever. In fact, again, we see God entering into a covenant with Noah. We also see God coming down to the Tower of Babel to see what wicked man was doing a few generations. So we can't take the 120 years to be literal years. It has to be a metaphor. So if it is a metaphor, what is it a metaphor for? And this will become more certain when we get to talk about the Mazzaroth sign of Libra and the way that God instructed his people to keep track of time. But, recall for a moment that the creation week is prophetic, right? 6 days of creation represents 6,000 years of man toiling under the curse. And 6,000 years of some people among all the people in the world claiming to be in a covenant and at times being obedient and others not. And 6,000 years of God's holy breath striving with and among rebellious people who call themselves God's people. That's what it's referring to. But look at this word years for a moment. It says 120 years. This word years, both in the Greek and the Hebrew, refers to a cycle. And most typically it's used to refer to a cycle of seasons, which is what we call a calendar year, right? So summer, fall, winter, and then spring. But it can refer to a cycle of any other type of year. So for example, the year of Jubilee, and again, we'll explain more about this when we get to talk about Libra and some of the things in the book of Leviticus, but we've talked about the Jubilee year before. The Jubilee year happened every 50th year. Now I know that the year of Jubilee actually wasn't given to the Jews until after they came out of Egypt, about 850 years or so after the flood. But that doesn't mean that the 50-year Jubilee cycle wasn't in place prior to the flood. Now, we can't prove it was, but we also can't prove it wasn't. We can't construct an argument for or against just based on silence. But what we do know is that Cain and Abel had been instructed to bring first fruits to the Lord at the end of the days. At the end of the days. And that implies some kind of a feast calendar, a feast day calendar. And it also implies specific instructions on how they were to give to the Lord. In other words, they had a covenant. Now, perhaps God had a time element in there as well. And so perhaps this concept of 120 years implied it was 120 Jubilee cycles. The fact that God's presence resided among the line of Seth, again, implies a covenant that was in place up until God destroyed the world in the flood, with the exception of Noah's family. So there's no reason to not believe that there was a timekeeping system already in place. So if the 120 years refers not to the annual cycle of seasons, but to a 50-year Jubilee cycle, then just simple math says that 120 cycles of 50 years is what God is referring to. And that actually turns out to be exactly 6,000 years, which confirms the 6,000-year prophetic creation week, and it perfectly matches with the time frame between the fall of man and when the king comes home to claim his inheritance, the return of Christ at the end of the tribulation. So what have we done so far? We're going to bring this session to a close, and I'm going to have to do a supplemental video to actually talk about the flood itself. So we talked about what was the pre-flood population. Well, it could have been up to a few billion, but at least hundreds of millions of people. That's a lot of wickedness upon the face of the earth. We talked about the sons of God, and we defined them as being the righteous line of Seth. But what we know at some point is that those who called themselves after the name of the Lord, that were in a covenant relationship and obedient to his laws, began to disobey, and they intermarried with women who were wicked. And just like we saw in later generations, they drew the sons of Seth away from obedience to God to the point where we saw wickedness upon the face of the earth. And even prior to this, even during the time when the sons of Seth were obedient and remained among themselves and married within their own community and maintained the sanctity and the precious nature of the covenant with God, even before that, among the wicked population, there were these giants, there were these tyrants who used intimidation to oppress people. And because of the wickedness had spread and had infected his covenant people, the righteous line of Seth, God decided to wipe everything out, and he made a statement, I can only do this so long. I'm going to do it for 6,000 years. I'm going to do it for 120 Jubilee year cycles, 120 times 50. So that's it for today. I don't know about you, but this last 50 minutes has actually gone pretty quick. The next time, and again, I'll do a supplemental video where we talk about Noah's flood. And then next weekend, when we do our next session, we'll be finishing off the introduction by talking about the Tower of Babel and the source of all paganism. Right? So stay tuned. God bless you, and I hope to see you soon.